everybody? Welcome to the Just Call It Podcast. It's the best motherfucking podcast in the whole motherfucking world. And I'm here doing something a little bit different. I just wanted to be a little real and show you guys my daily routine. And this is typically what I do after work. So after work, I usually come right here on the side of my house. I usually smoke a couple cigarettes, drink a beer, and I like to look at YouTube. Now, what do I look at YouTube? What do I watch? Now, I watch a gamut of things, but I like to share with you some of the best podcasts that I like, and sometimes some of the best history stuff that I like, and some of the best stuff that you could probably listen to and watch on YouTube and be entertained and learn something at the same time. Now, let me tell you my password to my computer. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Cheers. Today we're drinking Blue Moon. So this is kind of like my outside office. Kind of just chill here. I have all these little setups. I have a place to put my laptop. I have a place to put my drink. It's awesome. Now, here's some of the best stuff that I subscribe to on YouTube. Now, number one thing that you're going to want to subscribe to, with no doubt, better than the Joe Rogan podcast, better than any podcast, is my podcast, the Just Call It Podcast. That's the number one thing that you should do. Subscribe to my podcast, because it's awesome. It's a great podcast. You're watching it right now. Why not subscribe to it? It's pretty easy. You just hit the subscribe button, or whether you're watching it on Spotify, you're watching it on YouTube, or you're watching it on Apple Podcast. All right? Here's some of my subscriptions that I watch on a daily. Now, of course, I watch the Joe Rogan podcast, but the Joe Rogan podcast is no longer on YouTube. As it was back in the day, it was great to watch it on YouTube, to be able to watch and use YouTube on a daily basis, which probably made YouTube tons of money on all the data usage and all that crap. But now, Joe Rogan has moved his platform to Spotify, which is also showing video, which is still as great. I do like Joe Rogan's podcast typically on Spotify. That's just me personally. There's so many more things you can do with Spotify, as in user and interface friendly, with what your screen is, where you want to host it and stuff like that. Yeah, the YouTube was pretty good with maybe if you have a Google Chrome like myself, but still Spotify was pretty useful. So that's just my opinion. And another thing I like to watch is the Theo Vaughn This Past Weekend podcast. Is a great podcast that he's on. Theo Vaughn is a dude you probably remember from Real World if you're from the 90s like myself, born in 89. Theo Vaughn was great. He used to be on Real World. I think he was on New Orleans, and he was always the guy with the bandana. He always had a bandana on for some reason. I don't know why. I think it was like he almost thought it was also kind of like a Survivor Series, but it's not. But Theo Vaughn, he's a great comedian. He's been around for a long time. He has good stuff, great podcasts, insightful, funny guests. Also, he has some crazy guests that you probably never even think about having, like a guest like somebody who would always who works at a morgue and puts the bodies away and stuff like that. He talks about all the process and all the things they do. And if you're interested in random facts like that, like myself, then that's pretty cool, right? Another thing I like to subscribe to is I love Joey Diaz's podcast. I mean, his podcast is so good. I've been listening to that for a long time, called the Church of What's Happening. What's Happening Now, I think. It's a great podcast. He's a good dude. He has always been in some movies, side stuff, but he's also been on Mad TV a couple times. He also is a great comedian. He's just like in your face type of comedian, the type of comedian that you need to have balls to kind of watch. You can't be like too, oh man, what he says is gonna kind of hurt your feelings or something like that. He's pretty in your face. So if you like a podcast who's the real dude, he's Cuban, he's just so funny, man. The stories he's told, he's been a lot on the Joe Rogan podcast as a guest. Also, Joey Diaz has been on The Sopranos and the new one recently. He had a couple scenes with that, which is great. I mean, just seeing Joey Diaz, he's just a funny dude. He just has that vibe, like a mobster vibe type of dude, but he's just so funny because it's crazy that he's Cuban. He speaks perfect Spanish. He's from there and all that stuff. So that's another great podcast that I like to subscribe to. Another one that I also like to watch is the Kyle Dunnigan podcast. Kyle Dunnigan has his shows mainly on YouTube, which he kind of does kind of like a face. He does his he does kind of like, how would you say it? He does like a he uses people's faces, and he still does the podcast. So he would disguise himself as Joe Biden, disguise himself as Sylvester Stallone, disguise himself as Jack Nicholson. He also does a lot of other people. He does Kris Jenner as well, or Caitlyn Jenner, sorry. So it's a good podcast. I like that podcast. It's hella funny to me. Another podcast that I recommend as well that everyone should watch is King of the Sting. King of the Sting is kind of a light kind of podcast, I guess, if you want to kind of like joke around and it's mainly just a bunch of dudes talking shit, so it's more of a dudes podcast. I wouldn't recommend that just like for any chick to listen to that, but if you like just bros, bunch of bros hanging around. Theo Vaughn's also on that podcast, but he's rarely there now. But it's Delia, which is a great comedian that people probably know about. Brendan Schaub, UFC fighter turned comedian, and Erik Griffin. He's an awesome ass actor and also a comedian as well. What else? So some other good stuff. I think the last podcast that I think I would recommend anybody to check out is Dudesy. Dudesy is a podcast that's made only by AI, so the people who host the podcast have nothing to do with the podcast whatsoever. It's literally artificial intelligence running the podcast, running the monologue, running everything. So if you want to listen to a really cool ass podcast, check out Dudesy. Has Will Sasso from Mad TV, hella funny ass dude, and some other guy I completely don't know, and I hope if he's watching this, hope he laughs hella hard. That's a fucking great podcast. Also, I also recommend Chris DiStefano. Chris DiStefano, also hella funny ass dude. He's on YouTube. He's hilarious. I love his comedy. He's probably one of the best comedians out there, like hands down. I think he's like underrated. He's really funny, but I think he could like his comedy, I can imagine, is just so good, and his podcasting, the way he talks is just so hilarious. You can always laugh listening to him. He's a great dude. I recommend that for a man or woman to listen to, because he's just so relatable, so funny. Also, another podcast I recommend a lot for people to watch on Monday, if you want to have a good laugh at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, is the Kill Tony Show. It's a live show that basically you get 1 minute to do live comedy. So it's pretty funny. Some great people have become great comedians out of that show. People who were nobodies and turned into great stand-up, just killers, So just great stuff to watch, stuff to learn from. I learned a lot from it, from watching those podcasts to do my podcast. So, I recommend that for anybody, if you're trying to get some entertainment, boom. I can recommend plenty of other podcasts, but I would recommend also Tom Segura. I'd also recommend Two Bears, One Cave. I'd also recommend The Fighter and the Kid, which is Bryan and Brandon Schaub. So there's a lot of good ass freaking podcasts that are already good out there, but I think a lot of people, if you want a podcast that you can really like follow and just follow the whole show from the beginning to end, watching the first episode to the very staying up to date, boom, watch that podcast. Watch the ones that I recommended, and there you go.